I would like to start. Shall I start doing a few
Yeah, if you want
remarks,
us to,
Jordan?
yeah, go for
Yeah.
it.
So I'd like to start saying that today is also a very sad day in Brazil, and especially for us who are working in the Amazon, because the body of two journalists that were missing were finally found by Brazilian authorities in this region known as the Vale do Javari. And as you can imagine, I feel particularly touched by this situation because I've been working in the Amazon and I've been to that region, and it's a very sad moment for all of our community of journalists. One of them was Bruno Pereira, the Brazilian, and Don Phillips. I think it's important to mention them. Bruno Pereira became an indigenous expert, and he was guiding Don Phillips on his book, which is halfway written about indigenous strategies to preserve the forest. So yeah, I wanted to just mention that because I think it also relates a lot to the book itself, which is, this book is composed by 11 stories, 11 dispatches that I wrote. It's a non-fiction book, stories from the Amazon that I've been writing since 2016 and as a journalist. And um, I think the pieces of the book, they're very, I try to bring their the indigenous realities, indigenous words into the writings. So there is kind of like a contamination of these other layers of reality that compose the words that I try to bring in understanding what these conflicts, social environmental conflicts, the situations of violence, deforestation means. I'm also trained as an anthropologist. Thais and I, we met in school of we're doing part of this group of studies in anthropology, and I think this book is also permeated. It's traversed by a lot of different anthropological reflections. So, in a chronological order, it starts with the attempt of the Tupinambá indigenous group at the Tapajós River, which is in the state of Pará, on the eastern part of the Amazon. They have their struggle for self-demarcating their territory, as the Brazilian government doesn't recognize them as full indigenous. They're considered mestizos. They're considered like half indigenous, half non-indigenous, so they don't have the tenure of their territories. And they decided to go into the forest themselves to demarcate their land. And I followed them into this political activity to have the tenure and to preserve their territories and to stop the incursions of loggers and encroachers in general, um, and other people trying to convert their territories into soy farms. And just so the book covers topics such as deforestation, forest fires, the increase of soy monocrop plantations, as well as the Venezuelan migration in the region that I happened to cover. I went to the border of Brazil and Venezuela twice for doing that. And I think also the book is the stories of the book, although there are denunciations, like I'm denouncing violent situations, human rights violations and abuses. I also try to bring a human side to this story. So it's very focused on certain characters. Each of the chapter is also a profile of different characters, different people that are building their lives and how does it looks to build, how life looks like in these conflictual situations in the Amazon forest nowadays. And just to finish, I think it's also important to mention that the book has, it's a book you can see. I think there are beautiful moments in the book of these communities struggling for their territories, for their lives, but it's also a sad book. It's a book that has painful stories. People who were murdered are also present in the book. So I think the book has this tension between denunciation, like denounce these violations, and the struggle, the political activities of these different communities to fight for their land. So that's like the only things that I wanted to say to start. And thank you, Jordan, for being together.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. And hi, everybody. I can't see you, but you can probably see me. For those of you who don't know me, which is all of you, my name is Jordan Salama. I'm a journalist as well, a writer for National Geographic, and I was really honored to get this invitation. I wish that I could be with all of you there right now. Instead, I'm locked in my room, just a couple miles away, but I'm still happy that we were able to make this work. So I'll start by, asking some questions, and then we could probably quickly open it up to questions from the audience and make it a really nice conversation about this very important, timely, and beautiful in many ways book. So,
Jordan, let me just introduce your book too. So for you all who don't know, he's the author of Every Day the River Changes, which is also a reflection of different parts of the Colombian territory, not exactly the Amazon, but
right.
for the Andean to the Caribbean, and the reality of these different communities in the region. So just to mention your book as well.
Yeah, and there's lots of similarities, as we've discussed, between the two projects and the two books. So we can also talk about that maybe if as it comes. So
yeah,
I wanted to start by going off of what you had just said to end your introduction, which is by saying that this book is in many ways a sad and difficult book to read, because it's a book filled with stories of disappearance, of death, of vanishing ecosystems and communities. Of course, now with the recent context of the disappearance and the murder of the journalist and the activist, Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira, that just reminds us that this is a very complicated and difficult place. But there are also very moving vignettes in this book of a region known for and filled with life. One that stands out to me very sharply is a very short story where you discuss being in a canoe and coming across a jaguar swimming across the river. And it reminds us that, this is a place that is known for being the beating heart of our planet. So it's almost fitting that life and death are both in the title of this book. You write about death in order to further the protection and the preservation of life. But I wanted to know from you how you yourself maintain a sense of hope while writing through so much despair.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question. Great one. Well, I think it's all about having hope. These writings, they're writings of these critical situations, but there are also writings full of hope. So I like this ambivalence that you highlight right in the title, Life and Death. And I think if I wasn't full of hope that things will change, I mean, if we're seeing the state of what climate change means for the life on this planet, it's pretty clear that the Amazon forest is an important infrastructure for our futures, for life in this planet. And by saying this, I don't want us to imagine like, okay, the Amazon forest is just there. It exists as an autonomous thing, as nature and untouched place. No, it was cultivated by the work of thousands and thousands of years of different indigenous communities who domesticated the species, who built canals, who in archaeology we say there are a lot of archaeological studies saying that it's an anthropogenic forest. It's a forest that was also built by humans. So I think that I'm only doing this work because I also understand that there is a possibility of giving true value to what this, if you want, technology, what this other way of constructing, of building the world means for the whole world, actually.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I think also it's a challenge that a lot of people these days who are writing about the environment have to face, right? Because especially now in a world where so much of nature is defined by loss, we have to find ways to continue telling stories about falling in love with the natural world and the people who take care of it in order to continue this idea that we need to propagate the idea that we need to protect it. So getting into the book itself, and I want to go into the title story because I think the title story is a really fascinating one. Can you first talk about what it is, the life and death of the minke whale in the Amazon, but also, why you chose it as the title piece and why you think this story speaks to the collection as a whole?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I was invited by this editor from this very small Brazilian media outlet named Amazônia Real to write the story of the appearance of a minke whale in the Amazon 10 years late after it has appeared. So the idea we had just very not specific, this very broad idea that we wanted to say how the communities, by following the traces left by the whale, the idea was to retell the story of these people and the river through the story of the whale. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. And so it's in the western part of Pará, in the same Tapajós River that this Tupinambá indigenous group that I mentioned earlier, where they live. And so I went there and started following the traces of the whale. And I got inspired by reading Moby Dick at the same time because I thought, well, I need to write about a whale in the Amazon. And it's such an unprecedented story. It's a whale. Well, the thing is that the whales, they go from the Antarctic, yeah,
Yep.
yeah, to the Caribbean during winter time in order to get food. They eat krills, mainly like the small kind of shrimps, krill. And this whale, this minke whale, she got lost on her way back to the Antarctic, and she came through the Amazon River, and she was still going south, but she took a wrong way, and she appeared in the middle of this Amazonian community named Piquiatuba, is the name of the community, which is right in a very well-preserved region of the forest named FLONA, Floresta Nacional Tapajós, like Tapajós National Forest. And this forest is surrounded by a huge area of soy monoculture, which has been deforested in the last 15 years. So the process of deforestation has intensified since the whale appeared. So I took the whale became, of course, it's about the whale, and it's very much about what happened with this whale in fresh waters, in Amazonian waters, and their attempts to save the whale, which shows also their love for nature, and they're trying to save this huge animal, which was also mistaken. They thought it was an entity. They have a myth of a huge snake that appears in the river, and of course no one would imagine that a whale would appear 1,000 kilometers away from the ocean, deep in the forest. So they started to think that it was this myth of this entity, this big snake entity that had appeared. And so the story, so I follow the traces of this whale, but I'm also telling the struggle of these communities to keep their land, to the way they are afraid if they didn't have the tenure of this territory. And I think, land property is a very important thing throughout the book. I mean, it's not a bureaucratic book. It's not, full of hard descriptions of how this paper work, this state bureaucracy in Brazil works, but it's very important to understand, like, these communities are always fighting to have their territories, and they're frequently being deterritorialized, being kept away from their territories in order to projects such as monoculture, soy monoculture, to advance. And I decided to be part of the book because I think it's a very, somehow it has a kind of like a poetical approach to the fact that this weird animal appears right in the middle of the forest, and it talks, I think it concentrates, it condenses much of what the book is about. And I also like it as a title on its own.
I so agree with you, and it is very poetic, and I almost think that there's a magical realism element in it too, of like one of these fantastical things that can happen in real life. It almost seems like it could come out of, I told you this yesterday when we talked, out of like a Garcia Marquez short story, but it's true. And one thing that fascinates me about this story, and maybe this also leads into one of the other important stories in the book, which is that of the first indigenous person to die of COVID-19 in Brazil, which is the telling and the retelling of fables and stories of things that happen in life and how that those tellings and retellings of things, whether or not the stories themselves are true, demonstrate some aspect of reality in complicated places. When you're doing this kind of reporting, does that help you better understand the stories that you're trying to tell when you're hearing stories told by other people? I don't know if that
Yeah.
makes sense, you know?
Yeah, it makes absolutely sense. I think one of the challenge of writing these pieces is like how to show the human side of the stories, and what matters to these people, that they open their lives, they open their houses, they invite me to write about them. I mean, sometimes they ask the journalists to go, but sometimes the journalists who ask them permission to write the story, and thinks that it's an important thing to be told, and there is something going on in that. And I think that the least what we can do is to try to understand in which ways their word differs from ours, in which way the way they're composing their territorialities, the specific this relation with the land, with the rivers, with the stories, and why it matters for them to tell these stories. And in this specific case, the story of the first indigenous person who died of COVID in Brazil, and COVID was particularly harsh for indigenous communities. If we take the death rates of indigenous communities, they're much higher than the national average, due to a lot of factors such as lack of infrastructure, but also due to the kind of conflicts that these specific places are passing through. So there's a correlation. If you look at a place which is surrounded by soy farms, their death rate of COVID was much higher than those who are more further away and who have more preserved forests surrounding them. So this woman, Dona Luzia, I got asked by my editor to write her obituary, and it was a very sad moment to the family. It was April 2020, and with also difficult negotiations with the family, because at first they were denying that she died because of the virus. They didn't believe what the government was saying, but we had also the tests, so it became a delicate situation with the family. But I ended up talking about the importance of, and some of them already knew me because I was working in the area. And this story, we also wanted to bring as an homage to her. Her daughter was saying that she enjoyed telling a story about this young indigenous woman that disappeared in the lake, in the green lake of the community. It's a myth. It's not a story that actually happened to her in life, but it's a myth that she heard through generations. So we decided to add that to the story too, as a homage to her. And I think it's a nice one, because it's also in her community, the women are the leaders, not the men. And it's a very matriarchal society. And they have so this chief, the indigenous chief in Brazil, is named cacique, usually in the masculine, the word is, and she's a cacica. She's a woman, a cacica, a chief, a woman chief. So they were talking about like the group of chiefs is only formed by women, and I think it's an important aspect of the story too.
That legend at the end of the story is really special, and I'm really glad that you included it, because I really do think that it's those kinds of folk tales, myths, and legends that really add to stories of true life and everyday life, to help our understandings of how people live. In my book about about Colombia and the Magdalena River, that also informs so many of the stories when meeting people. And also, when you don't have as many experiences in common, you don't have context in common, even in the way that you think about the world. When you come into it from these stories that are almost universally interesting as fables, it helps both sides' understanding of a situation, and helps to build bridges, I think, between the journalists and the communities that the journalist is working with. So I'm sure that you had that similar experience.
Yeah, perfectly. Yeah, totally, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And And in that sense too, I'm interested in, you know, in asking you about the process of editing this book together, because I know that so many of these stories were done at different times and they deal with so many disparate themes. You cover everything from COVID to deforestation, dams, I don't know, minke whales, like lots of different things. And
Yeah.
what was it like to decide to put all those things together in a single book? Was it a challenge to edit that in a way, to decide the order? Like, how did that come about?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, these stories, they were published as journalistic pieces through 5 or 6 years of work. So in a sense, um, like they have a variety of themes, because as a journalist, you know, you cover different aspects of certain regions and what's happening in this specific region. And I think what was more challenging in this sense was which stories to select. And it was more like kind of like an editing process of selecting these stories and thinking through with the editors how to order and how to make sense. So, you know, a few of the stories that compose the book are about health issues, and also there is a specific chapter that I really like, which I followed these indigenous. I really enjoy writing this one, which is I followed. I followed these indigenous anthropologist whose name is João Paulo Lima Barreto. He's a Tucano indigenous person who just finished his PhD in anthropology, and for 15 years he hasn't been back to his home, which is right in the border of Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela. It's a very rich, biodiverse place, very well preserved area of the forest. And the thing is that his cousin got bitten by a snake when she was very young. She was probably 11. And she was took to Manaus, which is the capital of the state of Amazonas. And the doctors there, the physicians, wanted to cut her leg off. They wanted to amputate her leg. And the shamans, the healers, they are named Kumuã in this specific region, but in Brazilian Portuguese, we usually call them pajés. But it's fair, they also assume that they're also at ease by being called shamans. And these shamans, the Kumuã, they wanted to treat her in the hospital. And the doctors, in a very racist way, said, you know, no way, get out of here. You didn't study. We are the doctors. We spent 10 years of our lives studying to be here in the hospital. And if we don't cut her leg off, she's gonna die. And what happened at the end of the situation is that they called the prosecutor's office, the public prosecutor's office, to be allowed to treat her side by side with the doctors. And they ended up taking her out of the hospital. They had to sign that they assumed the risks of taking this indigenous girl out of the hospital to be treated with indigenous healing techniques. And, you know, she's fine. She didn't have her leg amputated. She didn't have her leg cut. She's married. I met her a few years ago. She has a beautiful family. And João Paulo is now, so he became very interested in understanding if we can have a priest in a hospital, if we can have a rabbi, why can't we have a indigenous shaman coming together to, you know, to do spiritual work and also to take part in the healing. So he decided to build an experiment. He started an experiment in the city of Manaus, where in the indigenous hospitals, you have both the shamans and the Western doctors working together. So this is a piece of the book. I'm just bringing that up because, you know, it's a story of, you know, the struggle for the indigenous knowledge to be recognized and valued together with the Western medicine conceptions. And I never thought I would be writing about that. You know, that's a topic that emerged, but coming back to your question, Jordan, it connects with a lot of different aspects of the book, such as then writing about health issues related to COVID and the effects of pesticides. So I think that health, the fight for the territories, and monocrops in general are three lines that cross the book.
Yeah, you can definitely identify those lines that run through the different stories. I remember the anecdote about the pesticides as well, which is a really impactful and sad, particularly sad story about how I remember it was like there was someone started buying up all the plots around one man's house, right? And then he noticed that everybody was getting
Yeah.
sick, and it was a particularly sad and powerful example.
Yeah,
Um,
as a strategy, when I write these stories, what I try to do is to also write profiles of the person. So these stories are almost profiles. So this one that Jordan's mentioning is the chapter named "The Poison Fields," and it's somehow a profile of this indigenous leader. This riverside community leader. He's not indigenous. He assumes himself as mestizo, but Mr. Manioc is his name, Senhor Macaxeira.
yeah,
And yeah.
it's a good one, and I agree with you. Well, I find it to be a similar thing where if you write, when I write about land or water, to do it through profiles of people is easier almost because it allows you to talk about these issues of nature and the environment, but through a human lens that allows readers to connect with it in a way that's easier, maybe a little bit.
Totally.
Yeah.
And how do you do that in your work, Jordan? More
How do I do
specifically.
that?
Yeah, that was a bit.
Yeah. Well, I try to find people in my work. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, and I
Yeah,
wanted to share about your theater exercise that you do with people. But I always try to interview the oldest and the youngest people in any place that I go, especially if I'm going to a small town, because I like to see how the perspectives differ between the oldest person and the youngest person, and how their experiences have changed over time. So that's one way I try to use human experiences to relate stories of a place, for example. And in other ways, I like to find craftspeople. And by craft, I mean not just like art, but anybody who's mastered a skill in a particular place. Usually, whatever that skill is says something about the place itself. So whether it's filigree jewelry, which is one person who I interviewed in a small town in Colombia that it reflects the migrations that have impacted the kinds of people who have arrived in that town and how they've shaped the landscape, or somebody who builds canoes, which I'm sure you've met many people who have built boats before, and how they have a very particular and deep connection to water and rivers that speaks to those waterways in different ways than if I was just writing about the water itself and the biology. But in writing about a person, I feel like it's easier to bring in all of those different elements together.
interesting.
Tell everybody about what you do, how you get people to interview each other. This is the most fascinating thing.
Yeah, because we were talking the other day, and I think that one of the things that I've been trying to do also as a journalist, as an anthropologist working in the Amazon, is how to decentrate, how to take like the whole responsibility and the questions from my side, and try to create a dynamics where we have different kinds of conversations. So something I did, which is very fruitful, was that it was in this Tupinambá village. I asked for this this much older woman who is she was 96 by the moment, and I asked to all her grandsons and granddaughters and sons and daughters, which was a crowd of 15, 20 people, to interview her. And it became almost like a TV show because they really enjoy doing that. And suddenly we had it was a kind of like a theater thing happening, had 60, 70 people together, and became a party. It became a party. And it was interesting to have the questions being posed not just by me, but by the doctors, the sons, and the grandsons, the granddaughters, and they created this kind of dynamic that worked really well, actually.
Why I love that so much is because, like we said before, where you as the journalist come from, or the person asking the questions, is always going to be different well, in cases like this, than the people who you're speaking with. And when you're able to put two different kinds of people in conversation with one another, the questions that people from the place will ask of people from that same place will be informed by the different contexts, I think, of where they come from, the experiences, the shared experiences that they have, that the journalist may not be able to bring that perspective. And so the combination of the two, of the journalist asking questions from an outside perspective and putting that kind of theatrical spectacle together, is, I think, brilliant. So I'm glad to hear that it's worked so well for you.
Thank you.
I have one more question. Well, I have many more questions, but I'm going to ask you one more, and then I think we should maybe open it up for some questions from the group. So
Okay.
my last question is about your process in general, because I'm always curious about asking fellow writers kind of how you take notes, how you pick people to interview, how you put everything together when you're writing a story or a book. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's always a hard question to answer. Well, you know, I'm trained as an anthropologist. I didn't go to journalism school. I studied anthropology, and I think that I would say my journalistic work is very influenced by these anthropological skills, understanding what an ethnography, which is a kind of a different kind of writing, means. But I think it's very useful in terms of descriptions and in terms of like in-depth interviews with person. I think that's the thing that I like the most, you know, spending days interviewing the same person and coming back. I think when you do this kind of, because I can also do other kinds of, and I often do other kinds of journalistic work, which is more either investigative or either more, let's say, well, where the narrative aspect is not that present. You know, I see these pieces here, they take seriously what storytelling means and try to reflect on how to tell these stories. But when for doing that, you know, you cannot just, you don't need just information. It's not about getting, you know, oh, he said that, period. It's not that kind of things that I'm mostly interested in. Is understanding the atmosphere, the flavors, the smells, the memories, and, you know, to contaminate the writing with these different words, because we can take for granted, you know, that nature just exists. As I was saying in the beginning, these communities, they have been building the Amazon forest and the rivers. You know, they have the myths they tell, they work in another layer of reality. And to come back to the question of Dona Luzia, for example, the first indigenous in Brazil who died because of COVID, you know, for her, the most important thing in her life to be recognized as an indigenous person was to fight for the right to celebrate the indigenous parties that the church has forbidden for decades. And she started this process of reestablishing the parties, the festivals, which for her is a political struggle, of course, and is what it means for her to be indigenous, to celebrate this kind of parties. So, you know, to understand that and to bring that to the story, and just not to be saying, okay, so the sheer numbers of death among Brazilian indigenous is higher than the average death of COVID, but you know, what is the word of these people and how to contaminate the writings, my writing with these other ways of building life on Earth. I think that's what I'm mostly interested on. I don't know if I answered properly.
Yeah.
But I didn't talk about like recording the notes, but
that's okay.
It's like this daily and historical reflections of their lives.
It's so important because it's like kind of layered writing where you can, I also don't really work in interview, like in formal interview ways of like making a list of questions coming and saying, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Like we usually, when I'm doing an in-depth project, I want to really immerse myself in the place and in the people's lives for many days, because like you said, there's so many layers that you can uncover if the longer you stay somewhere and the closer relationship you develop with the people, you can kind of peel off those layers and understand how people construct their lives. You know, I mean, a similar thing in how to understand the natural world as human constructed, or how myths inform a place. Like all of these things, I think, come from spending that deep time and not creating all the time necessarily this like formal boundary of I'm here to ask you a prescribed list of questions that I've come up with, several days ago, and that's not going to change. And then I'm going to leave, and that's it, because
Sure.
to allow the interaction to kind of inform the story. So
Yeah.
definitely. Okay, so can you turn me so I can see who's here? And
Yeah. So for those of you who were not here at the beginning, unfortunately, Jordan contracted COVID
nice. Hello, everybody.
2 days ago, so we're doing this hybrid. Yeah,
Cool.
if you have questions.
I can ask as many questions as I can, but please, yeah, I see one in the back. Go.
Hi. So I'm just curious, like both of you have books about kind of these things that don't necessarily live in a border, but borders do become such a big thing because we do live in this, border society of like Brazil, Colombia. So I just want to know, like, how does that play into, telling these stories of these people who don't, or like these, like the rainforest and the river who don't like, I don't know how to explain it. I hope that makes sense.
But can you talk a little bit more about?
Just like like the Amazon rainforest doesn't live in a border, but I'm just wondering, like, does the border of all these countries, like, does it come to play into your stories?
Yeah. Well, in some of the pieces I wrote, they are about border regions. Specifically the migration of Venezuelans to Brazil. I was reporting from the border for this Brazilian media outlet. So the border there plays a very important role in the story. And yeah, and the situation was that there was just to give you a comment on this story. For me it was more the most striking thing for me to report from the border was this sense of, like, the people I met, the people I interviewed, this sense of when I was there, they didn't really know where they were going. They were because they didn't want to stay in Brazil. They wanted to reach other Spanish-speaking countries in South America, so they just wanted to cross Brazil. But they were in the most further north part of the country. They wanted to get either to Paraguay, Argentina, not Paraguay that much, but Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and Peru also. And I stayed a few afternoons actually in the bus stop, just following what was happening there. And for me, that was the most astonishing thing, that people were just asking for tickets to go to Uruguay or to Argentina, but the same couple, the same family, they just wanted to cross the country. So this sense of, like, not knowing the value of the distances, the destination, the value of the currency, it was very confusing. Like this, my somehow forced migration situation was very confusing. And that's I guess that's the only story in the book that is related to borders, actually.
Oh, I was wondering, like, what's your relationship like with your subjects? Because, like, obviously they have to open up to you a lot, and sometimes it seems like you're there for a long time, but then it's like, do you see them again after that, or is it hard to, like, develop these relationships, or do you even develop relationships, or does that work?
I think that's one of the trickiest things in journalism, because sometimes you meet so many people, it's somehow impossible to build relationships with all the people you interview. Yeah. But I would say that you also get attached to some people, and if it's an ongoing situation, because some of the stories I wrote here, they're still ongoing. I mean, the deforestation of specific parts of Pará and advancement of soy monocrops, soy farms over encroaching indigenous lands is still an ongoing process. So I do get to develop deeper relations with certain people, but not with everybody. it's just very, very hard to do so. But this region of Pará, the Tapajós River, where I'm also doing my PhD thesis, so that's kind of easier because I come back often, and I think I can say it's fair to say that I've developed like feelings for these communities, and I often go there when I was covering also this very dramatic situation, which was the firefighters in Alter do Chão in Santarém, the same region of the Tapajós River, who were accused of putting fire in the forest to make money out of that somehow, to get donations for the NGOs, which was a very bad moment, because it was like the concretization, the realization, like what of a speech that Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro has, that the NGOs are trying to make money by putting fire in the forest. And we suddenly saw like this turn into reality, not because they were doing that, but because the police was accusing them of doing that. And it was so stressful to do this reporting that in a certain moment we understood that there were paramilitary groups related to these groups that were actually grabbing the land and accusing the firefighters. It was kind of like a complot, how to say that, in English? Sorry?
Wow.
A plot, yeah. And then I just called this older woman and said, hey, can I go to your place? Like, I'm exhausted. I need to, refresh my mind. Go to the river. And she said, yes, please. I know you're writing. We saw you writing. So, I was also able to create some human relations, which is very hard, and feel attached to them somehow.
Can I add one thing? I'm sorry, before we go to the next question, is that I think it's also important to just mention that now in the age of social media and these kinds of stories where you have to travel to a new place or go out of, the place where you live and do reporting, is it's never anymore the situation where I think you meet somebody and never see them again, or at least that's very rare. Usually you're able to keep in touch with people for long stretches of time. And so if a lot of time passes between when you do the reporting and have that initial encounter and then write something that may come out 6 months, a year, 2, 3 years later, in the case of a book, it could be up to like 2 or 3 years later, is that things can change in your life, in their lives. And a lot of times those updates inform the writing. And so it's not just the encounter that happens in the place specifically. And I'm talking about specific relationships with people, right? Those encounters that are shaped by what happens in the long stretch of time and what happens in all of our lives. And that ultimately ends up, I think, informing a lot of the stories too, specifically writing about people. I'm sure Fabio has had that experience as well.
Yeah, totally. And just before the next question, just one more additional thought. I think it also brings another kind of like set of ethical things, as Jordan was saying. You're gonna be read through social media, through the pieces, and what kind of something that I'm really think a lot when I'm writing these stories is what is ethically at stake when writing. I think it's completely different than interviewing a politician. Brings so many other layers, like what am I going to put in risk if I quote him by saying his name or her name? What is a fair, like how to relate to these people? Do they need this story to be out? If they don't need, what is the point of me going there, or they're seeking for somebody to hear and they open their lives? And as I said, this is also like some of these pieces, not all of them, but some of them, they are also investigative reports. We are explaining how the encroachment of this territory works. Now I'm about to publish a story, which is like how these meat packings in invading indigenous lands in the Amazon are exporting to UK and to the United States. So those are also investigative stories. But the book I selected the ones who has more kind of like narratives aspects together with this investigative part.
So this is gonna.
Oh,
I'm sorry. Are you sure? Okay, so my question might be a little meandering, but basically, like, my favorite books are usually written by people who have a certain closeness to the thing that they're studying, not necessarily like by proximity, although that too, but usually it's like an emotional closeness
Mhm.
with a thing. So that like, I think something that's interesting about being a journalist or an anthropologist is usually there's like an epistemological framework that you're entering into a thing with, right?
Mhm.
That gives you a distance. But it seems like the way that you're talking, there's like a certain closeness in what you're
Mhm.
talking about. So I guess like the thing that I'm interested in is how do you feel like being closer to these different ways of knowing
Mhm.
has most changed you?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good question. Well, I think also it depends on the situation. You know, it depends on how open you are. It depends on the people. I mean, these are human connections. Some people you get to feel more, you know, you feel more touched by the conversation, the situation you have. Some people you they touch in a less deep way somehow. And for me, I think what has changed a lot. It's a good question. I have to think about it actually. But you know, it changed my routine, my daily life. And the most basic thing to tell you is that it changed my daily life because I was working, spending half of every semester writing these stories and reporting from the region, roughly 3 months every semester. And I think that for me, like the most touching thing is like this awareness of understanding how, or trying to understand, or feeling touched by understanding, you know, like the place of these territories, because we don't say that, you don't say our house is our territory. Like, okay, I'm living here, tomorrow if the rent goes up, I might be living there, and if I meet someone, I might go to another city. If I'm approved as a professor in another city, I would just go there. We're not that much attached to certain places the same way that the majority of these communities that I've been reporting from are. So I think that, you know, the social construction of land for me has really, and it's not just a theoretical, critical perspective, you know, it's like understanding the emotions and the stories and the way they feel attached to these lands. I think for me, it's always something that shocks me in a good way, that this beautiful attachment to the, makes sense?
Of course.
Thais?
Yeah, so you mentioned like the human aspect of the Amazon, because like Amazon is the spotlight, but mainly like for climate change reasons and stuff like that. But like talking about people that live there and how the forest has been built by those people. But so like in a way, their way of living or their meaning, like the way they understand the world is kind of being threatened to. But on the other hand, I feel like there is no way things are gonna change now. Change is inevitable for those people. Like, how do you see like they do you feel like this change is already like going on? I mean, I know it's going on, but how they are doing like to adapt or to maintain things, like how this way of adapting and building again, like how do you feel like this change in their like way of living there?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I think that in general terms, if you think about like the current situation of the Amazon, I'd say that there are two extremes. One is, let's develop it in a very modern idea of, you know, building bridges, building roads, cutting down the trees, developing soy monoculture farms, and that's more the things that I'm writing in this book is about, like, it's a denouncing this kind of idea of modernization. And in the other hand, I think what we also have is a kind of like a conservationist, like an idea of conservation without humans, which is also very problematic. And you know, these ideas that, you know, we're going to preserve the forest, and this forest is going to stand, and we have carbon, and it gives the world a contribution in rescuing carbon from the atmosphere. So I think in both of these ways of understanding the development of the region, they exclude the people who live there. They exclude the human side of this forest. So, and what I'm most interested in is understanding what other ideas of development do these communities have, because they have ideas of development. It might be something different than these two extremes has. It might be because they also want and they are working to have better health quality, have better health infrastructure, and they don't think they're gonna cease to be indigenous because now they have a motorboat and they can fish and they can visit another relative easier than they could before. I think it's not about a question of like losing their identity. If they have TVs, they have well, refrigerators. Why not? I mean, food get bad if it's easier. I mean, we have to think that these communities, most of them, they were nomad communities, and they were fixed in a particular territory, which is only a fraction of their territory before they were fixed by the state. And health and food security are big issues for these communities, and they're trying to find what development can mean so we can have better health and food security. I think that's the way I understand, and trying to understand what development means, outer conceptions of development, and which is not the same thing that created climate change, the same very based on carbon, fossil fuels, monocultures. I mean, something I'm very interested, and this also for my PhD, but it's very present in the book, is like this formation, like this idea of monocrops, like cutting down this huge biodiverse forest and selecting just one single crop. So, and it has sanitary and ecological consequences because you need to use a lot of pesticides. I mean, I think you all here are aware of the situation, like the big famine in Ireland in the early 20th century. I mean, all the potatoes were killed by the same fungus that contaminated all these potatoes because they were all the same. So they were vulnerable to one single fungus. If you have a huge crops biodiversity, it becomes much more harder to have. And how do you avoid this fungus? You put pesticides. So, pesticides is really a thing now in the Amazon forest. And the current Brazilian government has been approving all the kinds of pesticides that are forbidden in other countries, in Europe, in the United States. And I think pesticides is something very important also to think about this relation, and the same way napalm was being used and Agent Orange was being used in the wars in Southeast Asia by including the Americans in the second half of the 20th century. It's being used to cut down the forest. They're just throwing napalm to cut down the forest and advance the process of deforestation. So, I mean, what kind of progress is that? What kind of development is that? Is the one that is going to keep on leading us to climate change and these amazing, outstanding crop agricultural losses. So, yeah, sorry, extending myself. Yes, Eduardo.
When you were talking about the borders, you mentioned this family just trying to go to Paraguay or to other Spanish countries. And I remember being in São Paulo by that time and hearing people saying so many racist things. And like, oh, these people are trying to steal jobs, they're trying to come here, blah, blah, blah. And I feel like that became you could realize that more when Bolsonaro was elected. People were more, at least they didn't talk about that, and they became more speech. They started to talk about this racist and these ideas. And for those who don't know, Bolsonaro was like the Trump of America. In Brazil, in South America, in a worse version. And I wanted to know how it affected the Amazon in the 6 years you started since you covered the Amazon. you start in a different government and how you see these changes in the government affecting the Amazon?
Yeah, I think it's a good question because what we're seeing now, if you get any measures of any indigenous land in Brazil, and you compare the 3 years of the Bolsonaro rule, from which we have consolidated data, to the 3 years before Bolsonaro is in power, there is a peak in deforestation in every single territory. I mean, I just worked on a story for Reuters. It's in English for those who don't speak Portuguese. You can also read that one. It's about the connection, and again, talking about the sanitary consequences of this model of development. So in the Yanomami indigenous land, which is right in the border of Brazil and Venezuela, the Yanomami being a very, it's the biggest indigenous territory in Brazil, is completely invaded by illegal miners. And there you have a correlation between deforestation, and because deforestation it's deforestation for illegal mining, and have these pools of standing water that becomes a perfect environment for malaria to spread, and especially non-falciparum malaria, which is the deadliest form of malaria. So you have together, you can really see the correlation between like 3 years after Bolsonaro, in the 3 years of Bolsonaro election, you have a peak in deforestation, you have a peak in illegal miners inside the Yanomami territory, and you have a peak in malaria cases. And I think that, Bolsonaro has created the possibility of these kind of invasions to happen. We have very strong consolidated data that points to that. It's not just like me as an anthropologist or a journalist who has some experience in the region saying that. I mean, all the data, all the specialists would agree that by defunding the environmental police and the indigenous national agency in FUNAI, by creating this speech, this national spread speech that he wouldn't find any of the people who, for environmental crimes, he said that there is a fine industry related to environmental fines. And you can see pretty clear in the data available, public data available, that the fines went down and the crimes went up. Jordan, you want to comment something? I'm sorry if you're here to be easier.
Oh, no, I'm learning. I'm learning and listening. Yeah, this has been great. Are there any more questions? I'm wondering. And Fabio, I know you want to read at some point as well.
Yeah, I wanted to read the next excerpt of the book.
Yes.
Do you want to? Do you have any more questions, or we can continue later? Okay. So I'll read this excerpt of the book with my perfect English. You're all gonna love it. But it's a story I wrote when I was in the Tupinambá indigenous territory in the Tapajós, and I would call it, in Portuguese I would call it a crônica, but I guess in English it doesn't translate good if I say it's a chronicle.
Oh, Fabio, we have so much to talk about. We need to talk about Crónica. Anyway, we have to do a whole other talk about Crónica in English and Latin America. Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll say it's an essay in English, but in Portuguese and Spanish it's a crónica. And it's I'm in this indigenous village, and we're together seeing on TV the widespread fires named as Dia do Fogo in the other side of the river. So I'm in the left bank of the Tapajós, and this was in BR-163, BR-163 in the other side of the river. So it starts like that. As I'm writing this, it's 2019. The year is not over, but it can be already considered a catastrophic one for the Brazilian Amazon. I spent much of it in the Tupinambá village of Cabeceira do Amorim, inside the Tapajós Arapiuns Extractive Reserve in western Pará. Nearly every night, Ezeriel and I would watch Jornal Nacional, which is the main TV news shows, in the living room of his home, a place of unplastered walls and usually crisscrossed with hammocks of the most diverse colors, size, and shapes. There isn't even a bed in the room Ezeriel shares with his wife, the Cacica Estevina, an important indigenous leader. His son and daughters have already left the nest and started families of their own. Some live in the city of Santarém, while others move to Manaus or Macapá. Many still live in the village and have become excellent hunters. Every night they return to their childhood home with their spouses and children, bringing fish and game to share for dinner. A few of them join Azriel and me as we watch the news on the surge and deforestation currently taking place in the Amazon. Our mouths agape. Azriel raises an eyebrow. The director of Brazil National Institute for Space Research, which is responsible for monitoring forest fires and other destructions of the rainforest habitat, was on a national network calling President Jair Bolsonaro pusillanimous and cowardly, after the president questioned the institute data. Since the beginning, his administration has been dismantling Brazil's environmental protection agencies. Quietly, as if holding something back, Azriel mentioned that loggers were looking to resume their activities inside the reserve, which he and many other indigenous Tupinambá and Kumaruara people claim as ancestral land. These are the same logging companies that have been devastating the Tupinambá territory, as well as that of other indigenous and riverside peoples in the region for decades. Now, they even have the support of some local residents, and logging has resumed to the east. The Tupinambá with their 20 villages are concerned, which is why they want to mark the boundaries of their territory clearly, to manage it autonomously and expel the loggers. But the wind is not at the backs of those striving to defend the rivers and rainforests. There is data collected by satellites, and there are the daily personal experiences of destruction. It is precisely in the tension between these two scales that I'm trying to write about the ongoing disaster, about the fate of the rainforest and its ways of life. Sheer numbers can't do it. They don't communicate enough to fully account for what's going on in the Amazon today. So then I keep on writing about crossing the river, and like the feeling of, like this proximity of having the fires. We could smell the fires. We could like see the smoke behind this national forest, which is preserved. And it finished this chronicle. This essay finished with this subtitle named "Elegy to an Amazonian River." And it's related to this question that you raised, Italia, about like affect and being in contact with the people that I've been reporting with. So sometimes I find myself thinking of this text as an elegy, but not for long. An elegy is a farewell, an expression of regret in the name of someone who has gone, whether dead or distant, leaving behind the person who is writing. To call this text an elegy to the Tapajós River would be like signing its death certificate, which is not within my power. But there is no shortage of reasons to suspect that the river is dying, or rather, that it is being murdered. Hydroelectric plants, gold mining, deforestation, and dredging, to name just a few. As a landscape, the Tapajós lower river is as natural as any human construct. Donateca, one of the oldest residents of Picatuba, the same place where the whale appeared, can see the river from her home. We enjoy the sunset together from her wide open kitchen overlooking the waters. At night, we sleep, rocking to the rhythm of the waves. In contrast with the serenity of the moment, she laments the effects hydroelectric dams have had on the river and on her life. She fears an increase in diseases and the departure of local fish populations. The river has changed color, she remarks. It's darker. No response comes to my mind, and I remain silent. So that's it. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Jordan, for being there, for the
thank you for
great
having
questions.
me. I feel very lucky to have been able to listen to you and to ask you these questions about this very, very important book. So thank you for finding a way to let me do this with you in a hybrid way. This is a real pleasure for me. Thank you again, Fabio, for the book and the work. And also, we should acknowledge Ezra, the translator.
Oh, Ezra, sorry.
Yeah, we should also acknowledge.
I'm sorry.
This was translated very beautifully by and in a way that I feel like you could probably speak to is very difficult to translate anything, but especially these kinds of stories.
Yeah. As you can imagine, the Portuguese spoken in the Amazon has a lot of specific terms. It's very rich in describing the forest, the environment, and the river, the colors of the rivers. And so Ezra Fitz, which is a translator, American translator of the book, he had an immense challenge to make this translation, and I think that for him it was very important to not let the Amazon River sound like the Mississippi River, because he could easily find terms to translate, to this very important, massive river, which has a historical, political, and ecological presence in the country, which is the Mississippi. But he wanted to find, other terms and other possibilities of exploring this lexicon in English also. So yeah, thank you everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jordan, for being here with us even.
Thank you.
Hope you're feeling okay.
Thanks.